Hello, everybody. This is Alan Knapp from Colorado State University. My assignment, as provided to me in an email from Anthony a few weeks ago, is to contrast environmental gradients versus experimental manipulations for trying to understand ecosystem processes. And in this email, Anthony indicated that I could provide opinions and results from our existing experiments, which I'm happy to do, as well as end with a priority question. And so I'm happy to do that as well. A bit of an outline for what I want to talk about. I want to begin with the review of the issue, some selected examples from the literature. This will cause me to actually reframe the issue a bit and ultimately avoid answering the question altogether with regard to which is better, using environmental gradients or experimental manipulations, but I will end with a priority question on this general topic. And the underlying assumption of what I'm about to present is as follows. This great picture of Anthony in the field, a great picture of an ecosystem modeler, I think, in the field in general, would be that he, of course, wants to understand the ecosystem he's standing in and how it's likely to change in the future as the environment changes. So I thought the simple approach to this I originally planned on taking was just to contrast the use of environmental gradients versus experimental manipulations, sort of in a tail of the tape approach, as they do when before boxing matches, for example. I thought that clearly if I did this, there'd be a clear winner. In fact, I should say I fully anticipated experimental manipulations to be the clear winner, since that's what I do. But as is often the case, things are never quite so simple in ecology, and so I need to begin with a little more background about this subject in general. So most of us know, I'm sure all of us know what manipulative experiments are. Here's just an array of pictures of different field manipulations that have altered water or temperature or nitrogen or other sorts of environmental drivers. These are relatively straightforward. We do a lot of them in ecology. The gradient approach is a little more complicated. There's a few more ways in which one can think about understanding processes by taking advantage of gradients. Gradients can occur in space across large geographic areas, or they can be derived over time from long-term observations. Now, when I think about gradients, taking advantage of environmental gradients, I usually think about large geographic variation in environmental drivers. This is just a diagram of the central grasslands of the Great Plains of the United States. There are strong precipitation gradients. Here in the blue arrow, strong temperature gradients. It's shown by the red arrow across this region. Certainly, ecologists have taken advantage of those gradients to try to understand how things like precipitation, which varies from west to east, might affect productivity, such as this graph shown, published by Osvaldo Sala many years ago. But you can also pick a particular place in the Great Plains, and you can monitor things like interannual variability in precipitation and interannual variability in above-ground net primary production, ANPP indicated here. And you can also develop a relationship between the two. So you can do it both spatially and temporally. And we can contrast experiments with these, and I'll show you some examples of those, but they don't always have to be large spatial or long temporal gradients. There are other ways, other gradients one can take advantage of. A quick example from our own work is we've been interested in how deluges, large individual rainfall events, might affect ecosystem processes in the arid grasslands, semi-arid grasslands of Colorado. Just some pictures of a student experimentally adding a large rainfall event to a plot. The graph down below here, as you can see, just shows how soil moisture responds to a variety of different sizes of rainfall events, varying from a 20 millimeter event up to a 120 millimeter event. You can see the soil moisture responses there. One can contrast these sorts of experiments with natural gradients in rainfall that occur in our part of the world. We tend to get very intense thunderstorms that are also very localized. This is just a map of the grassland site we work at, and a map of the gradient of precipitation amount that fell during an individual thunderstorm in the afternoon. You can see there's a region here where rainfall is very high, over 70 millimeters, and of course, spatially across this gradient, precipitation amount decreased from that thunderstorm cell. So you can use this approach as well to contrast with experimental approaches. Okay, so let's go through a few examples of how experiments and gradient approaches compare to each other in terms of trying to understand how ecosystems might respond. And I'll begin with the good news, the good examples. One has to do with just the example I gave you, comparing experimental responses, those local spatial gradients that I just talked about with regard to deluge impacts on ecosystems There's the plot I just showed you of a particular rainfall event in this shortgrass steppe site. There's the normalized difference vegetation index, satellite-derived index of greenness of the response 20 days later of the ecosystem to that gradation in rainfall. We were able to contrast how natural rainfall events, in terms of the size of those events, how they affected ecosystem processes with our plot scale experiments where we added different sizes of rainfall events. And the take-home message is that when we did these experiments at different times of year, we saw different levels of responses. We saw the same sorts of things in the responses to natural rainfall events. Mid-season deluges or large events tended to result in the greatest response in these systems. And when we did this experimentally, as we varied deluge size, we saw those relationships were mostly linear between precipitation amount and ecosystem response. And we saw the same thing again across spatial scales. So giving us some confidence that what we're learning experimentally plays out over the landscape at a larger scale. Another example I've been involved in has to do with looking at the temporal gradients in precipitation and its effect on productivity. So I've worked at the Konza Prairie Long-Term Ecological Research Site on the other end of the Great Plains for a number of years. We've done a lot of experiments there where we've manipulated both additions and subtractions of precipitation and looked at ecosystem responses such as net primary production, ANPP. We also have long-term records there, over 30 years now, of how interannual variability in precipitation affects above-ground net primary production. So we plotted those two together in this paper, trying to see if they were telling us the experimental approach versus taking advantage of these long-term temporal gradients. They were telling us the same thing. And the bottom line is they really are. So the observational data here, this is just the percent change in growing season precipitation. So wetter years than average, drier years than average versus the response and productivity. The dark circles here indicate all the observations we've made across this site over the last 30 years or so. The open circles are the results of experiments. You can see that at least within the range of normal variability, that's what these dashed lines indicate here, the range of the observations we have. What the experiments tell us about the sensitivity of this system to changes in precipitation is pretty similar to what the observations tell us as well. Of course, the advantage of experiments is we can extend this inference to wetter years that occur naturally and drier years that occur naturally, and that might tell us something different about these systems. And probably the best example of contrasting experimental results to all sorts of gradients comes from this paper here from the Arctic region of the world, published in 2015. Here, the authors contrasted a number of different ways in which temperature has been varied and looking at how the community of these plant communities responded to changes in temperature. So they have what's called a community temperature index in terms of the response of the community to warming. So warming has been imposed experimentally. Warming has occurred over time. They've looked at warming across elevational gradients. Of course, it gets cooler as you go up in elevation. And they've looked across the region at warmer and cooler parts as well. And the bottom line here, when they contrast or compare all of these different ways of asking the question, how are plant communities going to respond to warming, they get similar answers, although the magnitude differs a bit. Now, there's not so good news as well. There's also examples in literature where experimental observational studies actually tell us very different things. A recent example that I really like a lot is this paper by Yuan et al. And they compiled experiments and observations from all over the world to try and understand if experiments and responses to environmental gradients were telling us the same thing with reference to climate change. And what they found is that's not the case. So they found that across all of these experiments, when you add water, you might decrease soil nutrients. But if you look at how those soil nutrients vary across precipitation gradients where it gets wetter, they found out that those nutrients tended to increase. So you got the opposite response with water additions. They found the same thing with water reductions. Experimental drought increased these soil nutrients, but if you looked at these responses across aridity gradients, they decreased. And then finally, they looked at warming experiments as well and saw the same thing. Experimental warming generally increased these nutrients, whereas they decreased along gradients of increasing temperature across the landscape. It's not just soil nutrients that respond this way. There's a paper now a decade or so looking at how traits in plant communities might respond to variation in precipitation. In this case, they compared experimental water addition studies and how the community responded, at least traits in the community responded to those. to community change across natural precipitation gradients. And the bottom line is they found essentially opposing responses. So the experiments favored the increased precipitation favored species with small seed size and short lifespans and high nitrogen concentrations, and they saw exactly the opposite shifts in these traits when they looked across precipitation gradients. And then to complicate things even further, even within these different gradient approaches, spatial versus temporal, you can get different answers as well to the same question. So here's a paper by Osvaldo Sala showing one previous relationship and some new relationships. So this is the relationship between above ground net primary production and annual precipitation. These thick solid lines here indicate the relationship based upon large spatial gradients in three different continents, the Great Plains, the Serengeti, and Mongolia. But if you look at individual sites within all of those regions, you see that you still see a positive relationship, but the slope is very much different. So the sign of the response is the same, but the magnitude can differ dramatically depending on whether you're using a spatial gradient or a temporal gradient to try and understand the driver of a process. So where does this leave us? There is certainly some comforting convergence among experiments and gradients that would make us think that both approaches can tell us the same thing. In other cases, we see similar signs, as I just mentioned, of response, but different magnitudes. And then the worst case scenario is we see, totally opposite responses. And so I think it might be worth reframing this question from a strength versus weakness approach to a what do we really want to know or what are we trying to do approach to understand which approach might be best to use. Are we interested in testing a specific theory? Do we want to focus on an individual mechanism? Are we trying to understand interactions and feedbacks? Are we trying to truly just predict the future? Those are very different questions that might necessitate very different approaches to the kind of experiments or environmental gradients we take advantage of. And in fact, I want to talk a little bit more about that based upon these two papers here, one of which I'm a co-author on with Melinda Smith, and the second of which relates back to this soil nutrient paper that had a really nice discussion about the merits of these two different approaches. If we think about these three approaches we just talked about, they actually tell us quite different things. We can think about short-term single-factor experiments, something you might do where you might alter temperature, for example, for 2 or 3 years in a row. This really tells us something about how the ecosystem is going to respond to a very sudden change in a particular driver over a well-defined period of time, the length of the experiment. And primarily, we're going to learn about physiological responses of the organisms and other rapidly changing processes during this experimental time frame, microbial responses, biogeochemical responses. You can think about temporal gradient studies, so the kind of data collected at long-term ecological research sites where you have many years of production data, for example, versus a variation in temperature from year to year. Now we get responses of the ecosystem to what are the nominal changes in that driver that occur in the system over a set period of time. But of course, there's other things going to be changing as well, in addition to temperature, right? Could be wet and dry years, differences in radiation, growing season length, those sorts of things. So they're varying at the same time as temperature is. And again, you're probably going to learn mostly about the physiological responses of the organisms in that system and other rapidly responding processes. As long as variation is relatively random, if there's directional change occurring over that long period of time for this temporal gradient, then you might learn about community change or a few other more slowly changing processes that occur at the ecosystem scale. And then finally, think about these large spatial gradient studies across large geographic regions. Here we're assuming now that the spatial gradient provides some insight about how temporal change might occur. We're learning about how different ecosystem types might respond to a driver against a backdrop, again, of all those other sorts of drivers, some of which might co-vary, some might not, over a long period of time. And the time period, of course, is much longer now because there's been enough time for a number of different ecological processes and really evolutionary processes to play out over these large spatial gradients. Probably the biggest disadvantage of trying to use this kind of approach to predict the future is that really what we are is a prisoner of history here. What we see now across these gradients is a product of all the contingencies and past disturbances and other sorts of factors that affect ecosystem structure and function. And what happened in the past, of course, is likely not to be that insightful for what's going to happen in the future. And of course, if you had a lot of resources, a lot of funding, you could combine all of these approaches into one. You could think about conducting multi-factor instead of single-factor experiments over long time periods and replicate those along environmental gradients across multiple ecosystem types to maximize the kind of information you could gain from doing these kind of studies. But I think an assumption that many people have brought up in reading the literature that holds true in most of these approaches is as follows. That is, people usually assume that differences between gradient and experimental studies or approaches will diminish, particularly if those experiments are allowed to run for a long period of time, and if they're replicated across those environmental gradients, and that ultimately then results that might differ initially between experimental and gradient approaches will eventually converge into some level of understanding of how ecosystems will respond to change. And let me just provide one brief example for you. This is from the paper by Brody Sandel et al. That I mentioned earlier, where they noticed these opposing trait responses to experiments versus the geographic variation. And they provided this diagram near the end of their paper where they try to explain how this sort of thing can happen when you think about community change these community traits over a long period of time. Recall the short-term experiment resulted in one directional change in abundance of traits. The long-term, the gradient study that they conducted, which is looking across different communities, showed those traits change in a different direction with precipitation. So precipitation addition in the short-term experiment reduced the mean traits. Precipitation increases across the gradients increased those traits. And what they argued is, as you can see here in the green, is that if you would just run those short-term experiments long enough, eventually the mechanism that dominated the trait change would vary. So initially you have a change in abundance of the different species that have those traits, but over a long enough period of time you would get species turnover, community change would happen that would then ultimately reflect the kind of change you would see in those gradient studies. Okay, so let me end with what I think then, based upon all this, is a priority knowledge gap for our attempts to try and understand how ecosystems are going to respond to global change. I would argue this, that the big gap is we really need to understand the consequences of what I'd like to call time-scale mismatches in this world dominated by rapid global change. And we know ecosystems have always dealt with change, variability, extremes, disturbances, those sorts of things, but much variability in the environment. But global change, of course, is unique because of the directional nature of that change. It's warming, CO2 is going up, variability in precipitation is increasing, and this unprecedented pace of change that's occurring as well. It's occurring much more rapidly than in the past. And because ecosystem processes all have different response times, there's going to be mismatches, right? So some aspects of ecosystems will respond more rapidly than others, and thus our past understanding is probably not sufficient to predict the future. A simple example is in the Great Plains. If we look at soil organic matter gradient, for example, gradients across the Great Plains, it increases from the southwest to the northeast. If the climate becomes warmer with climate change and drier, we'd expect plant communities to move along that gradient as well, move from southward to northward. And this will, of course, move them along soils that are very different in fertility. So communities and species that once existed on low fertility soils will now be growing on soils that are much higher in organic matter facilities. So these new ecosystems will be comprised of this interesting mix of new species that came from the south, that had strong dispersal characteristics, along with the resident species that essentially already existed in this part of the world, and that can already tolerate those warmer and drier conditions. And all these are going to be growing, of course, on a substrate that's the product of the past, not the product of the present. And so what the consequences are of these continually changing mismatches, I think, it is the real knowledge gap that we need to try and fill. Just another way to think about that, or another way to visualize that, is just a variation of what we published in this paper back in 2009. If you think about how environmental drivers are changing over time and ecological processes are changing over time, a simple way to think about it is something like this. So here's the change in carbon dioxide or the change in temperatures that might occur over time. Physiological acclimation of the species that exist as things warm or CO2 changes is probably also pretty rapid, can occur pretty quickly. Community change is going to be a slower process. It requires the death of some species and the increase in others. Species dispersal, migration, immigration is a process that operates on a lower time scale. Probably is not going to be able to keep pace with changes in CO2 and temperatures. And then, of course, what I just mentioned, soil edaphic properties are likely to change most slowly. And so when we think about the past, we think about these different processes and drivers being pretty close to each other in this diagram. Today, they're probably much further apart in terms of being out of equilibrium or mistimed, in essence, with regard to how much they're changing in response to these drivers. And in the future, we can expect these mismatches in the timing of responses to the environment to be even greater. And again, what the consequences are of these is really a key question. And of course, it's important to remember that none of these trajectories I've drawn here are actually linear, that the rates of these responses are going to be very species specific, and that some of these responses actually have limits at some point in time to where they would not continue to change throughout. So I've used more of the time than I should, but I'm done with this presentation. It's easy to sort of have some despair when one thinks about trying to understand these mismatches in processes and drivers, but I do really think it's one area we need to spend more time thinking about in designing experiments and other studies to better understand. Thank you.